Not 5,000 years ago, not even 500. Just 150 to 200 years ago, the world was completely different. There was a global civilization so advanced that it built structures we still can't replicate properly today. Buildings with perfect acoustics, free atmospheric energy systems, and architecture that appeared almost identical on every continent. They called it Tartaria, or the Great Tartarian Empire. Old maps from the 1700s and early 1800s show Great Tartary as a massive territory stretching across most of Asia and parts of Europe. Not a bunch of scattered tribes, a real, unified, highly sophisticated civilization. Then something happened. Around the mid-1800s, a series of catastrophic mud floods supposedly hit cities worldwide. Entire ground floors of buildings were suddenly buried under meters of mud and debris. In many places, what we now call basements were actually the original ground floors. Look at any old city, you'll see windows and doorways half buried below street level. We're told they just raised the street level over decades, but why does this pattern show up in cities all over the world at roughly the same time? The official story says we built all these grand structures ourselves in the 1800s, but here's what they don't want you connecting. The World's Fairs, especially Chicago 1893, Paris and San Francisco 1915, showed jaw-dropping temporary buildings that looked exactly like the supposed Tartarian architecture, massive domes, intricate stonework, perfect symmetry. They were supposedly built in just a couple of years, then torn down immediately after. Why build something so magnificent just to destroy it weeks later? Even darker, after the supposed mud flood, there were suddenly millions of orphans. The orphan trains in America shipped hundreds of thousands of children across the country. Were they really orphans? Or survivors of something much bigger? And the technology Tartaria supposedly had free wireless energy. Buildings with massive metal spires and domes weren't just decoration. They were antennas. Nikola Tesla's work on wireless power suddenly makes a lot more sense if he was simply rediscovering something that already existed. The reset theory says the mud flood wasn't natural. It was a deliberate cataclysm, possibly caused by directed energy weapons or a massive atmospheric event followed by a full historical rewrite. They changed the timeline, rewrote the history books, and told us we built everything ourselves with horses and basic tools. Here's the part almost nobody connects. Why do star forts, those giant geometric military structures, appear all over the world with almost identical designs? Why do Capitol buildings on different continents look like they came from the same architect? Because they did. This wasn't just a lost civilization. This was a global reset one that erased an entire advanced society, so a new ruling class could take control and rewrite reality. The mud is still there. The buildings are still there. The only thing missing is the truth. But here's where it gets darker. The mud flood wasn't just one event. Evidence suggests multiple layer cities buried under cities, sometimes 3 or 4 levels deep. In some places, the basement you walk into today was once the 3rd or 4th floor of the original structure. Excavation photos from the late 1800s show entire streets being dug out of solid mud, with perfectly preserved ornate architecture underneath. Why does this pattern appear in Chicago, Seattle, London, Paris, Moscow, and even parts of Australia and South America at almost the exact same window of time? The official story says urban development or flooding, but that doesn't explain why the mud is often sterile, almost no organic matter, no bones, no everyday debris you'd expect from a natural disaster. It looks more like liquefied sediment dumped from above, and the timing? Right as the Industrial Revolution supposedly took off, right as the old monarchies were being slowly replaced by new banking powers, right as the history books were being rewritten on a massive scale. Now look at the World's Fairs. Chicago 1893, the White City, supposedly built in under 2 years with horse and basic tools. Massive neoclassical buildings with perfect symmetry, intricate stonework, and lighting systems that looked electric before widespread power grids existed. Then, the moment the fair ended, most of it was burned or demolished. Why build something so magnificent just to destroy it? Same pattern in Paris, San Francisco, Buffalo, and others. Alternative researchers point out these temporary structures looked exactly like the grand Tartarian buildings still standing today. Some believed the fairs weren't exhibitions, they were clean-up operations, a way to show the public these buildings existed, then quietly remove or claim them as their own. Then there's the orphan trains. Between the 1850s and 1920s, over 250,000 children were shipped across America on trains. The official story says they were orphans from the Civil War or urban poverty, but the numbers are suspiciously high. And many of these children had no records, no clear origins, and were simply absorbed into the new system. What if they weren't just orphans? What if they were survivors of the reset? Children pulled from the ruins of Tartaria who needed to be reprogrammed into the new historical narrative? The architecture itself tells its own story. Star forts appear on every continent with nearly identical geometric designs. Why? Buildings with massive domes and metal spires that were clearly designed as antennas. Windows and doorways buried below street level worldwide. Heating systems built into the foundations that modern engineers still can't fully explain. And the free energy aspect. Old photos and patents show buildings with copper domes, mercury-based systems, and atmospheric energy collectors. Tesla didn't invent wireless power from nothing. He was rediscovering technology that already existed before the reset wiped the knowledge. The elite didn't just hide a civilization. They stole its technology, rewrote its history, and used the reset to birth the modern control system we live under today. Central banks, compulsory schooling, the medical industry, and the carefully crafted timeline that tells us we went from caves to smartphones in a few thousand years. That's the part they don't want you connecting. The mud flood wasn't the end of Tartaria. It was the beginning of their world. And we're still living inside the lie they built on top of the ruins. But the cover-up didn't stop with mud and orphan trains. Look at how quickly the history was rewritten. By the early 1900s, school curriculums, museums, and official records began presenting a brand new timeline. Humanity went from primitive hunter-gatherers straight into the Industrial Revolution, with almost no advanced civilization in between. Anything that didn't fit was labelled pseudoscience or quietly removed from public view. Old maps showing Great Tartary were replaced or corrected. Ancient structures with impossible engineering were redated or attributed to slaves with ropes and ramps. Technologies that once powered entire cities were dismissed as myth. This wasn't accidental. This was a narrative reset. And if you follow the bloodlines, the pattern becomes even darker. The families that rose to power right after the mud flood era, the Rockefellers, Rothschilds, Morgans, Vanderbilts, suddenly controlled banking, oil, education, and medicine. They didn't just fill the power vacuum. They built the new system on top of the old one's ruins. Compulsory schooling, designed to teach the new timeline. Modern medicine replaced ancient holistic systems. Central banking locked the population into debt from birth. Every institution that now controls us was either created or heavily reshaped in the decades right after the supposed mud floods. The buildings we still admire today, the grand libraries, cathedrals, government halls with their perfect proportions and impossible acoustics, weren't built by the people they tell us built them. They were inherited, and the inheritors spent the next century convincing us we built them ourselves with horses and hand tools, right after the Dark Ages. This is why Tartaria triggers such strong reactions, because once you see the buried windows, the star forts, the orphan trains, the world's fairs, the sudden explosion of new banking dynasties, and the total rewrite of history, you can't unsee it. The mud flood wasn't the end of an empire, it was the birth certificate of the current one, and we're still living as tenants in their reset. The stones remember. The mud still sits under our feet, and the bloodlines that benefited most, they're still here, still in control, still terrified you'll connect the final dots.